take these sessions, this session here, send them to your children, especially if your children are getting ready to go to college. Because guess what? Within about 2 or 3 hours of them being with their first professor who is a God hater or an atheist or doesn't believe in God, they will bring things up like this. And if they're not prepared or don't know what the context is, then they will have doubts.
Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn and I'm here with Steve. And this is part 3 of a topical series we're doing on slavery. And if you're not familiar with our work, then I would encourage you to look at the main thrust of our work, which is to do verse-by-verse Bible study. And we go passage by passage, verse by verse, and explain the text. And as we go along, we talk about issues. And we've bumped into an issue of slavery. And so we're taking our time to slow down just a little bit and go through some of these passages, these kind of problem passages and questionable passages that deal with the issue of slavery. And because slavery is such a sensitive issue, as is understandable, and there's so much pain in the world because of it, then therefore we thought it wise to explain what the Levitical law and in the New Testament says about it. And Steve, this has been kind of interesting to me, but we're into part 3 now. So if you didn't hear the first 2, we'd encourage you to go back and listen to those.
Yeah, because it is detailed, and we do go into detailed. We try and keep our sessions around a 30-minute mark. Occasionally we go over, but in the last 2 sessions we've gone over about 10 or 15 minutes, and so we've gone into plenty of detail. And in order to put the part 3 into context, listen to part 1 and part 2.
And again, what we're doing is explaining these passages, but we're also trying to answer some of the questions that arise in the minds of Christians and in the minds of skeptics and atheists. Because slavery is such an emotional, painful issue, then the people that are attempting to tear down the Bible and attack God use these passages just because they are so emotional. I remember years ago when slavery wasn't on the front of everybody's minds, and we didn't hear much from the atheists. But suddenly when it gets to be a sensitive issue, then they drag out these favorite chestnuts. As we said in the first and second one, slavery is real. It's very painful. We're not trying to dodge that. What we are trying to do is very directly deal with what the Bible says about it. And we've gone through in some detail here. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 21. And last time we spent quite a bit of time on Exodus 21, verse 21, which is one of the ones that, again, our friends in the skeptic and atheist community use to say, Exodus 21:21, if you're, let's start in verse 20. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. However, if he survives a day or 2, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. And we explained that last time, that it's really talking about fining them for a debtor that you can't pay yourself if they lose time. And what we made a big point about was that in several passages, all people are treated the same. It is not the case that someone can, he's my bondservant, my bondslave, so I can abuse him at will as I would a piece of farm equipment. That nothing could be further from the truth. Look down at verses 23 and through 25. If there's any further injury, then you shall appoint a penalty for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And so with that, that prevents all of this accusation of you can just abuse a slave. And we pointed out that over in Leviticus, I believe it was 24, had the very same language, that all people have to be treated equally under the law. Slaves cannot be isolated for abuse.
Yeah, all of these laws that we're going through here, they're deterrents. Here are people that have put themselves into voluntary servitude for various reasons that we pointed out and went through in detail in part 1. These are deterrents in order to let the people know that, look, just because they have put themselves in voluntary servitude or put themselves in servitude to you or are under servitude to you, are noted here as slaves, that you can't abuse them. There's punishments that's going to be revolve around that or evolve from that, and that they also have rights to go before judges. We're going to see that in a little bit. So even though they're these bond slaves, bond servants, maid servants, they have rights as well.
And had to be treated equally under the law. So again, look at verse 25. Burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And verse 23, any further injury. And if they did have this happen to a slave, what would they do? Look at the end of verse 22. May demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. So there was a system of judges, and if we would have just taken the time to have read through the book of Exodus, we found that there was a whole chapter there where they set up a system of judges over large numbers and then hundreds and tens. There was a system. This was the beginning of the rabbinical system of judges, where anyone, slave or free, could say, hey, I've been bruised. I had an injury to me. Any further injury, this was unjust. Just because I owed this man money and had to go to work for him, I was under a bond. They abused me. And the judge would then make a decision. They had rights. It was very similar to what happens in the military. There's, if you go join the military, they're going to tell you in advance what the rules are. Right. Part of the rules, they're going to tell you what clothes you have to wear and where you can go and where you can't go and when you can go there and when you can't, how much you're going to get paid, what you have to say and how you have to say it, what your job's going to be. And in return, you have, as a soldier, have rights. And you can go before a tribunal and say, my commanding officer abused me and violated the rules because, and you lay out your case and the tribunal would decide. Same exact situation here. There are judges. Again, look at end of verse 22. As the judges decide, there were a system of judges, and even down verse 25, if they get bruised even or any further injury, then they have, the bond slaves have rights. The system had to treat everybody the same. To take this and wrench it from its context and make it sound like the slaves are just a piece of farm equipment, nothing could be further from the truth. It's setting out a system of morals for everybody.
And as we pointed out last session on verses 26 and 27, if the injury is to the point that they lose an eye or even lose a tooth, you got to let them go. And at that point that you're letting them go, they're free and clear of whatever debt that they owe you. So again, all this stuff serves as deterrence to the people that are overseers or over these people that have put themselves into servitude to them.
And again, it mentions losing an eye or losing a tooth. It doesn't mention every body part. It'd be a long list if you mentioned every body part. But the judges would then take that principle and apply it. Hey, this person's maimed. You blew out their knee or broke their foot, and that's an abuse. They have to be set free. And there's judges that would decide this. It was everybody had to be treated the same. And so I just find this, if we just read the passage, then we end up with these answers. Try to make this say that it's giving freedom to owners to treat people like chattel property or to abuse them. It's just not true. Now down at verse 28 and 29, it mentions there that if an ox gores anyone to death, whether they be bond or free, the punishment's the same. In verse 28, 29. And then in verse 30 to 32, the only difference is that if the ox gores a son or a daughter without killing them, the parent can state the money payment due to them. If an ox gores a bond slaves without killing them, the payment's mandatory at 30 pieces of silver. Okay, so if it happens to a son or a daughter, the parent can mandate the money, but if it's a bond slave, it's got to be 30 pieces of silver. It's not a small chunk of change. It's a decent amount of money. So, okay, I've heard some people say, well, see, there's a difference between, well, they're not taking advantage. It just set a price because the bonds were different, and who's going to say what the price would be because the amount that the bond slave owed was a different amount of money. So they just said, here's a standard price. So it's not, again, it's protecting people, not saying, oh, he only owed me a little bit, and he had worked off most of it, and so therefore I'm not going to pay him. No, you have to pay him. It's a guarantee of money, not a way to take any out. The idea that Exodus 21 creates this separate system of justice is just false. It's just false. Anybody that says so is either not taking the time to look at the text carefully, or intentionally leaving sections out and only showing you other certain ones, or they're intentionally looking for things in the Bible to tell lies about, or all three of those, because the text says something quite different. It's actually protecting the lives of people that had an obligation to pay a debt. And that's what it's all about. Eye for eye is a command for equal punishment. What eye for an eye means, and tooth for a tooth, is that, okay, well, you came and hurt my pig, so I'm going to go over to your house and burn your whole house down and kill your whole family. Right. No, if you hurt my pig, then you owe me a pig.
Right.
It's equal justice. That's what it means. Just to point out one more time, Leviticus 24:22 says, quote, "There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native." Now, the next passage, Steve, is in Numbers 31. And that's another one that is one of these kind of chestnut passages that comes up. We're going to start down in the middle of the chapter, but the key part here in Numbers 31 is at the beginning, they're going to war with Midian, which was one of these peoples of Canaan that were evil child sacrificers that were frying their babies alive on the hands of Molech. Or in the specific case of Midian, they had temple prostitutes. They had a lot of women that, as a religious ritual, were prostitutes. They had seduced a lot of the men of Israel. So in Numbers 31:7, Israel comes and kills all the Midianite men. And then in verse 9, they captured the women. And in verse 14, Israel brings back the Midianite women to Moses. Now, Steve, what was the command from God to do with the entire population of Midian?
They were to put them to death.
They were to put them to death. They were to put all of them to death. Sounds awful cruel.
Yep.
Well, why would God command such a thing?
As you pointed out, they had been given chances to repent for hundreds of years. They had also were doing very, very evil things. So here it's not a case of God just arbitrarily coming up and saying, you need to kill these people. No, it's judgment on these people for what they were doing and the way that they had acted.
And so what's going to happen here in this passage, and let's go ahead and read it. Steve, if you could start in Numbers 31 and read 15 to 18.
And Moses said to them, have you spared all the women? Behold, these caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. So the plague was among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man intimately. But all the girls who have not known man intimately, spare for yourselves.
So with this, we have this original command to go and kill all these people of Midian because they were evil people that God had given a chance to repent and they had refused. In this case, it says they had this plague that had happened, which was basically venereal disease. They had temple prostitutes and they had seduced the men of Israel to go have sex with these prostitutes. And there'd been a disease, a plague, that had spread through the population because of these temple prostitutes. That's the background for all of this. And when it talks about Peor, the sin of Peor, that's what it's talking about, is this sex slavery, the sex rituals that were going on. What's not going on is a sex slavery scheme on the part of Israel that God endorses. Our skeptical friends look at this through the eyeglasses of a sex-saturated society. We've gone so far off the deep end with sex in our society that when they spare the women here to be your own, the accusation is they've turned them into sex slaves. Really, again, the law of Moses, it's more than just this one passage. Deuteronomy, Leviticus, half of Exodus, half of Numbers or all the Mosaic law. Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 10 and following, gives specific instructions to Israel on what to do for wives that were taken from the people around them. The women could be taken as wives, but were not to be abused. It says that in there, and they could not be sold for money. So they were, instead of killing them here in Midian, like God had originally commanded, what did Moses do in verse 15? What was his question?
Have you spared all the women?
Have you spared the women? Well, why would he ask that? Because they were supposed to kill them.
Right.
They're the ones that had brought in the venereal disease. Why did you spare these people when they caused the problem in the first place?
Now the ones there, though, in 18, the ones that are allowed to spare are the ones that have not, they're basically virgins. They have not known men intimately. And so therefore, since they have not had intimate relationships and they're basically virgins, they do not have the disease. They're known that they would not have the disease because it's not as venereal disease. It's passed through sexual acts.
So these are not sex slaves. These were women.
Right.
That were to be used as marriage, or they could use them as servants. But they were people that, through mercy, they had said, okay, well, we already have this plague going on, this venereal disease, so we're not going to take the prostitutes in. We'll go ahead and originally do what God commanded, which was destroy them. But the virgins, if you want to take them and marry them, now think of what that does. That basically incorporates them into Israel's society and culture, but destroys the Midianite culture while saving the more innocent ones. That was the compromise that Moses allowed here. But again, you could not take them as just sex slaves, which is the accusation. In verse 16, in the matter of Peor, so the plague was among the congregation. The same sin was mentioned over in Joshua chapter 22, verse 17, says, quote, is not the iniquity of Peor enough for us, from which we have not cleansed ourselves to this day, although a plague came upon the congregation? And so the plague and the consequences to it from the same sin of Peor by these Midianite prostitutes was still around many years later in Joshua's day.
Yeah.
And so that's the context here. This isn't we're capturing them as sex slaves. No, it's saving their lives and incorporating them in as wives. Because, again, the Bible prevented sex slaves. It says so specifically. Okay, so God commanded these people to be killed, but in here he allows this. The next passage was in Leviticus chapter 25. And in Leviticus 25, there's some commands in there about given to Israel when they enter the promised land and have to deal with these Canaanites. And again, all of these sections from Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers are all just prior to going into the land of Canaan and dealing with these evil Canaanites that were temple prostitution, child sacrifice, etc. And in verse 25, it talks about redeeming a person's possessions when they become poor. Redeeming a person's possessions when they become poor. And so in Leviticus 25, verse 25, that gives credence to what we've been saying all along, which is if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinman can come in and buy back what his relative has sold. And so right there we have this case where they become so poor that they've had to sell things. So, Steve, look down at verse 39, and that's really where it gets interesting. In verse 39, if a countryman of yours becomes poor with regard to you and sells himself to you. So, yeah. Steve, would somebody voluntarily sell themselves? In our day, we can't imagine such a thing as buying someone, selling myself to someone. Why would somebody do that?
Because as it points out here, if they're so poor, meaning they are destitute, meaning they can't provide for themselves, they can't provide for their family if they have a family, they have no means in order to take care of themselves. If they become so poor that they sell themselves. Well, that's what it means. I mean, it's pretty plain and clear.
And what we do in our society, I submit, is not any better. What we do is we tax all the working people and then pay people to count the money and then redistribute it to the poor people and don't require them to work. And as Apostle Paul says over in the New Testament, if you do that, you teach them to be idle. And in such cases, okay, yeah, there's some legitimately poor people, but people get to where it's called institutionalized victimhood, in the sense that I have no other way. Well, God's way says, well, you're either going to go work or you're going to starve. That's what the Apostle Paul says over in the New Testament in Thessalonians. He who does not work should not eat. And so here we have, in this passage, people become so poor, they're going to force themselves to go work. They're going to force themselves to go and sell themselves in a contractual arrangement where I've made an agreement with you. I will do these things. I will do these work if you feed me and clothe me and house me. And so that's what it's talking about. It's not a slave market. It's people that are so poor that they have no other choice. And if you've eaten in the last 2 weeks, then you have no moral high ground to stand and look at these people in the eye and say they shouldn't do that. And so that permeates all of this. It's not a chattel slavery. Now look down at verse 45. And verse 45 deals with foreigners. The last one was if a citizen. The foreigners were not allowed to buy land in Israel. Keep that in mind. How did the land get controlled in Israel? What was the rule, Steve, about the land in Israel?
Well, the land was allotted or divided up all in the individual tribes, and that particular allotment to that tribe was then given to the individual families that lived in that tribe. And once those families had those particular allotments within the greater allotment of their tribe and around, it was theirs in perpetuity. It was their land within their family forever. And even to the point that if they happened to give themselves or sell themselves at some point in time, they could come back and redeem the land to themselves. They just showed that, hey, this is my land. I'm part of this family. This was allotted to us, and I'm here to redeem it, to get it back into our family.
Matter of fact, the other parts of the Mosaic Law prevented people from permanently selling it to foreigners.
Yeah.
You had to keep it in the family. The whole thing was to keep the family land on the land, so they would always have a way of making an income to protect poor people. And so a foreigner that would come in, which is what this chapter is dealing with, has no way to become a landowner. They have no way to earn a living, to become wealthy. It's an agricultural society. And so these are people that would always be travelers, sojourners is what it's dealing with. Look at verse 45. There's out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among that you may gain acquisition. And some of the translations there have a different phrase for that. You may acquire a bondslave. So these are people that were poor. They were permanently poor. They couldn't own land and earn a living that way. And so they were people that you could acquire. Why? Because they become so poor that they had to hire themselves out. That's the only way they could make it. The word acquire there is Strong's 7069. It means to acquire. It means to get. It doesn't mean to buy. It just means to, well, it could mean buy, but it's just any way of acquiring someone. Hire, make a bond with them, make an agreement. In Boaz, in the book of Ruth, the same verb, he acquired his wife out of love in Ruth 4:10, used the same word there. So it's not always buying and selling people as if they're farm implements. That's not what this is talking about. It's a way of taking care of the poor and making sure the poor didn't get taken advantage of. And so that's what it's talking about. That's what it's talking about. God had originally told Israel to kill all these people, and now he's making allowances for them to take care of them. right? Because if they would have did what they were supposed to, they wouldn't have this. And later, by the time you get to the end of 2 Kings, Israel is sacrificing their children because they did let these sojourners leave here. So verse 45 and 46, once the bond slaves are acquired, they become permanent possessions that can be inherited as permanent slaves. And right there is where people kind of trip over that, right? They become your possession. It says it flat out. And the reason why we took so much time with this is trying to explain this situation. These people were prisoners of war. These people were Canaanites. These people were frying their own children. And God sent Israel in as judgment that says, destroy them all. And they didn't. They kept some of them. So now you've got these aliens there, and what are you going to do with them? So he says, okay, you can hire them, you can buy them, but if they do, they're going to be your permanent possessions. And it's because, again, what are the logical options? You can either kill them, is that better? Or you can let them live and go free, in which case they're going to be all the same pagan practices right next door. And again, you were just at war with them, so they'll sneak up behind you and slit your throat in the middle of the night when you're not looking. Or you can throw them in a cage like we do to people, along with another insane person, and leave them there like an animal for the rest of their life. Or you can give them meaningful work and put all these other protections of the entire Mosaic law that says you can't even bruise them unless they go to court and say, you've bruised me, so I get to bruise you back. You have to feed them. You have to take care of them. You have to bring them on the holidays. You have to give them a rest every seventh day. And so that's why we can say with confidence that people, if you're poor enough, would want to be under this circumstance. They would want to go and say, please buy me, is what the people were doing over in Genesis and in Egypt. That's why saying this is somehow evil is just wrong. So, comment, Steve, did I miss it, or what are your thoughts as we go through this?
No, I'm in agreement with you. You know, another thing that I've heard the skeptics say, kind of as a pause at this particular point in time, they said, to throw it out there, said, you know, to people, well, would you go underneath and become a slave under the rules outlined in Exodus chapter 21? And my response is, yeah, given the conditions that we've laid out and the reasons why, and also known from other type of archaeological finds of how the other nations in the ancient Near East treated people and treated their slaves. Yes, the slaves that were here, the servants, they were there for because they were starving, because they had made agreements in order to do it. They were freed after a period of time, after 7 years. Even in Jubilee years, they were freed as well. They had rights. They could go before judges if they were mistreated. So yes, given under that particular point in time, yes, I would go and live underneath I'd rather live under those conditions that were laid out by God with the Israelites than I would be with the Canaanites and the other ones that were around who mistreated and didn't have these type of rules.
Right. And so again, just to summarize the Old Testament, the slaves had rights. They could not be bruised. They could not be beaten. The passage in Exodus 21 that talks about beating a slave is talking about not paying back the owner because it was his money. And again, that verse 20 Exodus 21:21 does not override the other verses in that chapter and the ones we just read, which says everybody has to be treated equally, eye for eye, bruise for bruise, stripe for stripe. So you cannot beat them without them claiming, hey, they maimed me and I get to be set free. I'm free of my bond. And so all of these protections were in place, and it's just not true that people were treated like property. They had rights, all the full rights of citizenship required by the Mosaic Law.
And it also talked about in chapter 21, verse 16, where it completely forbade for any slaves to be that were kidnapped or stolen. The literal word there is steal, which breaks the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. It says not only ones who are steal, or if they are found in your hand. In other words, if the slave was found to be owned by the person through the means of kidnapping or stealing, the penalty for that owner was death. So once again, the things that we think about as far as people in the slave trade that were taken and taken away from their homes and kidnapped from their homes and sold by other tribes to Europeans and others in the 1700s and 1800s, that was completely and without question forbidden by God to the people of Israel as well. So once again, would you live underneath the rules laid out here in chapter 21? Yes, because if I was a slave that had been kidnapped, even if I was found to have been within, guess what? The penalty for the person that had me was death. So yes.
I have personally met people that were citizens of countries that were the worst of communism, the absolute worst of communism, the worst you could imagine of being in communist control, of telling you every move to make, what you're going to do for a living, the absolute worst. They were very poor, and when I asked them what was it like being under that, and they said, in one sense, yeah, we didn't have hardly anything, but in one sense it was comforting because we didn't have any stress. There were no decisions that we could make because there were no choices. And in one sense, they were kind of feeling, the person I was talking to felt a little nostalgic about it. It says, if we went back under that, I wouldn't have all the stress I have now. And so, again, talking about the question, would you sign up for this? If I had a guarantee of all the protections in the Mosaic Law, I can't be beaten. If I do, I get to go to court. They have to feed me. They have to treat me with all the rights of all the other citizenship. I work off my agreement and I get to go free. If they hurt me, I get to go free. Then I could do that if I was hungry enough. Guaranteed job. And if I found a wife, I could either wait till 7 years until she gets off and we get to stay married, or I can stay there and work for the person. And it's all these protections are there. Now that's Old Testament. That's Old Testament. Let's look at the New Testament, because New Testament talks about slavery as well. And again, we're trying to hit all these verses right between the eyes, not dodging anything. There's passages in the New Testament, we'll admit right up front, that tell bond slaves to obey their masters. Says it several times. Ephesians 6, verses 5-9, Colossians 3:22, 1 Timothy 6:1, Titus 2:9, 1 Peter 2:18. All those passages say that if you're a bond slave, then you should obey your master, right? So what's the alternative? What would be the advice? I've heard people say, oh, my advice would be to tell them to run away. Well, or disobey or work stoppage or whatever. If they, again, you're speaking to Christians. And so first of all, as Christians, what's going to happen to the cause of Christ if you're a bond slave and you're under this bond, this obligation to this owner and that owns my bond? Then what's going to happen if I become a bad worker? What's that going to do to the cause of Christ? And so that's one of the concerns. That's one of the reasons they say that. Again, New Testament written to believers. And so the alternative is either run away, in which case you've defrauded the person that paid your bond, and that's stealing. If I run away from the bond, then I'm stealing. The other alternative is stay there but be disobedient, in which case you're going to give a bad reputation to Christ and invite punishment on yourself for not meeting your obligation that you had agreed to do. Or stay there but be obedient and be a good witness and work off your bond. So what's the alternative? Again, if we don't look at this through only the lens of what we saw as Western slavery and then it's a very different picture.
Yeah, the context of those that you gave there is in regards to an order. And so it's not just talking about servants, it also talks about the children and how the people should also obey the government, because the government is provided by God as well. And so there's other things in related that's in those contexts. It's not just with the bondservant. One other thing before we go further too is there was another condition where a person, and we didn't read it, but if they decided they were set free, in other words, the seventh year had come up and they were set free, they had an option to stay. And if they voluntarily wanted to stay with the family, with the ownership, and be with them, they would become a voluntary servant to them. And what would happen would be is that they would take and prescribe. The prescription was for them to take an awl, put it in their ear, in order to signify, and then a ring there to signify that they were a voluntary bond servant or voluntary servant, a slave to that family or to that owner, patriarch that was there. Now, this is to put in context in regards to what was going on with other nations. In the Babylonian rules, that is noted as the Babylonian Hammurabi Code, that was found on this stele that had all this code that was there. Code number 282, if a male slave has said to his master, "You are not my master," his master shall prove him to be his slave and cut off his ear. So here's in the Babylon, you didn't have the opportunity to say, look, I don't want to be your slave anymore, right? You weren't set free after 7 years. And if you did speak up and say, hey, I don't want, guess what? They cut your ear off. Things like this that people look at it and say, oh, how barbaric to put an awl into the ear and to show that he was a possession of the other. Again, put it in the context of what was going on in the ancient Near East for all of these other countries or nations that were going on, and the cruelties that were actually take place in these other countries.
Right. So it's very different. The people in the Old Testament and the New Testament had rights and protections. Let's look at a couple of verses in the New Testament that does deal specifically with this idea of slavery. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 23, quote, "You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men." So look at that verse for a second. First of all, it's talking about salvation. You were bought at a price. So our salvation is compared to this idea of a bond slave. Somebody paid for you. And so you are now under this obligation to them. But more practically, look at the second part of that. Do not become slaves of men. Well, that assumes that somebody has the control over whether or not I'm going to become a slave or not.
Right.
It's, again, if somebody were to knock me in the back of the head and kidnap me in the dark of night and haul me off to a slave market, I wouldn't have much control over that. But this command is, you are already paid for by Jesus Christ. Don't go and make yourself a slave of men. That assumes that I have control over whether or not I'm a slave of men, which again is why we belabor the point. If I go into an obligation, I've borrowed money and I can't pay it back, I'm going to turn into a bond slave. And so he's saying, don't do that.
Right.
Saying, don't become a slave. Don't voluntarily put yourselves under the slavery of men. The slavery in many cases was voluntary. If it wasn't voluntary, it's prisoners of war. That is the vast majority of what we're talking about here. And kidnapping and slave markets were prevented. You couldn't do that. So the next one, if we look at another passage is in Philemon. There's a little book in the New Testament called Philemon. It's only one chapter. It's written from the Apostle Paul to a man named Philemon. There was a runaway slave by the name of Onesiphorus. And Onesiphorus had run away from Philemon and had met the Apostle Paul and had become a Christian. And Paul had written this letter to his friend Philemon, who was also a believer in Christ, and had given it to Onesiphorus and sent it back to Philemon. So the letter in the New Testament of Philemon is a letter about this slave that is now a Christian and was returning to his master. And so a couple of key verses here. Look at Philemon, verse 16. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And look down at verse 18. But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. So what is he saying? He's saying this slave, treat him like a brother.
Right.
Again, look at 16. Don't treat him like a slave, more than a slave, a beloved brother. Treat him like a beloved brother. And oh yeah, by the way, that bond that he was under, I'll pay it. If he still owes you anything, put it on my account. So again, this isn't chattel slavery. This guy Onesiphorus, for whatever reason, had an obligation to Philemon. And the obligation has to get paid. And Paul says, if he hasn't worked it off yet, put it on my account. But meanwhile, treat him like not just a brother, a beloved brother, not like a slave. And so this is the picture in the New Testament. Did they go and try to overthrow governments and change secular laws in the Roman Empire? No, they were trying to start a church. So we can't have it one way and say, oh, we want separation of church and state, which means we don't want you messing around in the government. But then on the other hand, say, why didn't you mess around in the government? I mean, you can't have it both ways. If we really look at what the New Testament says, okay, maybe we could say that they should have done it another way, but they were being moral to these people, and they were telling them to obey the law instead of disobey the law. Now, to me, Steve, all of that whole thing about slavery boils down to something that I think is missing in most of these conversations, which is how are we described as our relationship with Jesus Christ as Christians? What this whole slavery thing gives us a picture of what the New Testament says our relationship is in Christ.
Well, we're noted as bond slaves. In other words, we're noted as ones who have voluntarily decided to become a believer in Jesus Christ, and that we should serve him that way.
And this theme about slavery is picked up by the Apostle Paul and others in the New Testament, and this makes a great description of our salvation and what Jesus did for us. In Romans chapter 6, pretty much the whole chapter talks about when we start out as human beings, we are a slave to sin. We're a slave to sin. That's the description of the lost person. But then Jesus comes along and pays our debt. Romans 6:18, having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness, unquote. So we start out as a slave for sin, and we have this obligation to be paid. It will get paid. Jesus came along and paid our sin debt. And so now, since he paid for us, we're bought with a price. We're his now. And that's the wonderful relationship. And we lose that picture when we mischaracterize biblical slavery, which was this bond slave. There was a bond involved, an obligation that had to get paid. And Jesus paid our debt for us. That's the good news.
Correct. And we went through in part one and put it in context in regards to what, that again, words change and meanings of words change throughout centuries. And so putting it in context, go back and listen in part one of that, where we put those meaning of slavery or servitude in context.
And we'll wrap up with this. If you've listened to us this far, everyone is a slave to something. Everyone is a slave to something. You, sir, you, madam, are a slave to something. You're either a slave to your own sin, you're a slave to your own personal fleshly desires, or you're going to accept Jesus and become a bond slave of Christ. and let him become your master. And if that happens, then now we're a slave to righteousness. We're a slave to Jesus Christ. And that's what the message is in the New Testament. And that's really the good news.
Yeah, and then also finishing up, I want to say this as well. For the believers that are listening here, this is an example of how you address topics that skeptics and God haters want to bring up in order to take believers and take them away from God, or even keep other people from becoming believers in God. Take these sessions, this session here, send them to your children, especially if your children are getting ready to go to college. Because guess what? Within about 2 or 3 hours of them being with their first professor who is a God hater or an atheist or doesn't believe in God, they will bring things up like this. And if they're not prepared or don't know what the context is, then they will have doubts. And some of them even go to the what's popular these days is to deconstruct and go away from their faith that they have. These are topics that, as we've gone through, we've taken 3 parts. We've taken 3 sessions to go through these and explain what this is. Send them to your friends and family. Send them to your daughters and children, especially if they're getting ready to go off to college. Let them listen from God's perspective and God's point of view and put them in context of what's going on related to this. Don't just turn them over to the skeptics, the atheists, and the God haters just for them to misrepresent the Bible and misrepresent God.
Right. So we'll end here. With that, we'll call the slavery session to an end. And we thank you for staying with us. We try to reason through these carefully. It's a lot easier for the skeptics to just throw out an accusation really quick, and it takes us a while to kind of explain the true context. But we'd rather do it carefully. That's what we do on Reasoning Through the Bible. We'll trust that you'll be back here with us next time.
Thank you for watching and listening, and may God bless you.